Tattoos. Around 38% of people in the world have at least one of them. But have you ever wondered about the origins of them and where they came from? Well, on this episode of The History Of, we're looking at the history of tattoos, from their ancient beginnings to an increasingly popular form of art. People have been tattooing their bodies for thousands of years. The earliest evidence we have of tattoos being used are between 3370 and 3100 BCE. The evidence for this came in 1991 when a body was discovered in the Otzi Alps. Despite being thousands of years old, the body was naturally mummified due to the freezing conditions, and the mummy became known as Otzi the Iceman. Otzi boasted an impressive 61 tattoos, the majority of which were located on his legs. Rather than using ink like we would use today, Otzi's tattoos were created using the ash, likely from a campfire. Today we see tattoos as a form of body modification, a way to express yourself and the things you love or enjoy. However, one of the specialists who examined Otzi was Professor Don Brothwell of the University of York, and he has a very different theory for Otzi's tattoos. Don noticed the tattoos were located in strange positions, such as the lower spine, right knee, as well as the ankle joints. He suggested that the tattoos may well have been used as some type of acupuncture to help ease joint pain. This would explain the strange positioning of his ancient body art. A whole range of similar tattooed bodies have been discovered from 49 countries around the world that also boast their own mummies. However, Otzi is argued to be the oldest and even holds the accolade of Europe's oldest mummy. Discoveries in ancient Egypt, dating back to at least 2000 BCE, are the next piece of the puzzle. As with most things historical, there are always debates and different theories for why the Egyptians had tattoos. Some people argue they were used for decorative purposes, while others argue they had more medicinal properties. One of these discovered mummies was a priestess called Amenet Hathor, and she had a variety of different scars on her body. It's theorised that the placement of the tattoos on the mummy could have been seen as a treatment for pelvic peritonitis. In ancient Egypt, tattooing was a practice only carried out on females. When the tattooed mummies were originally discovered, the tattoos were thought to have been markings of a royal concubine or a prostitute. But the markings on Amenet seem to debunk this theory, as a priestess was of very high social status within Egypt at this time. The tattooing process would remain a female-dominated practice in Egypt until the Meroitic period, between 300 and 400 BCE, when Nubian men began to get tattoos as well. As there are so many civilisations that have carried out tattoo practices, I could go on forever, but for the sake of this video not being too long, I am going to jump forward to the next major breakthrough. James Cook was a British explorer, navigator, cartographer and captain within the Royal Navy. From 1768 to 1771, he travelled to the Tahitian Islands, and during this voyage he was introduced to the art of tattooing. When they landed on the islands, they were initially shocked by the heavily tattooed population. James Cook kept a travellogue, and he was looking for a word of what to call the incredible markings. He overheard the locals using a word similar to tattoo. At this time, the word tattoo was a military term used to describe rhythmic knocking. This would take place at what was called the closing of the taps, which was basically the last orders for drinks in an old tavern where they would turn the beer taps off. A specific drum beat would be played that would call the soldiers from the taverns back to the barracks. The rhythmic tapping of wood tools they used to give these markings reminded Cook of this, and that's why we know the word tattoo today. Japan, like many civilisations, also wasn't new to the idea of tattooing. From 1603 to 1868, in what's known as Japan's Edo period, having ink was common in certain subgroups. One of these groups was the Ukiyo, which consisted of firemen, manual labourers and prostitutes. It was also common in 17th century Japan for criminals to be tattooed. This was done to help them stand out, and the markings would typically be made on criminals' faces, bodies and arms. Tattooing was actually banned in Japan in 1868 as it was viewed as a barbaric practice, but eventually began to become popular among gangs known as the Yakuzza. Because getting a tattoo was painful, these gangs believed that having tattoos showed a sign of courage, and the illegality of them was also a way of showing that they were criminals for life. Even today when we hear the word Yakuza, it's synonymous with the thought of heavily tattooed Japanese men. By the 1800s, tattooing in Western cultures was still only practiced by a very small number of people. Many non-tattooed citizens had never seen people with tattoos before. This led to so-called freak shows and exhibitions showcasing tattooed people, and one of these people was Emma de Burgh. Her and her husband were famous at the time solely for their heavily tattooed bodies, and in 1891 they made an appearance in Berlin with the astonished crowds who had never seen anything like it before. 1891 is also the year the tattoo gun was created by Sam O'Reilly. He made tweaks to an invention that was originally designed by Thomas Edison. The original design was intended to be an electric pen that could be used to make stencils for posters, but O'Reilly tinkered with this design and created a tattoo machine, a technology that's still used to this day. Going into the early 1900s, ink was only really common on circus performers, criminals and sailors. Many people would get tattoos that would have a link to their lifestyle or profession. It became common for soldiers to get anchor tattoos and was often a form of initiation. On top of this, some sailors would get tattoos that would symbolise their journeys or voyages that they'd been on. A turtle would mean that a sailor crossed over the equator, and a journey of over 5,000 miles would be marked with a swallow. This developed into what's now known as the traditional style of tattooing. 1920s were the decade where more women began to get tattoos, although it was for a much different reason than the sailors. They would get them as a cost-effective alternative to makeup. Because makeup at the time was so expensive, women sometimes got their eyebrows tattooed on, or as an alternative to lip liner. A few years later in 1936, America implemented social security numbers. Because of the importance of these numbers, some people took to getting them tattooed on their bodies, usually on the wrist or arm. This was mainly done as a matter of convenience rather than a symbol of their job or background, so they weren't viewed in the same negative light as many people of the time who had tattoos for decorative purposes. When World War II broke out, we saw the introduction of Sailor Jerry tattoos. These were created by Norman Keith Collins. Collins created his own colour pigments, which he would then work into his tattoos. This only helped to popularise tattoos even further, especially among the US troops fighting overseas. The women back home began working in factories to help out with the war effort. This led to an increase in the number of women getting tattoos and furthered the growth of the industry. Even with these developments, if you had a tattoo during the 50s or 60s, you were still viewed by the majority as a rebel or a criminal. New York City actually criminalised tattoos in 1967 after they blamed tattoos for the spread of hepatitis B. The ban was actually only lifted in 1997. Popular celebrities of the time such as Janis Joplin began getting their own tattoos, and new cultural groups such as bikers also began to adopt tattoos as a form of expression, and at the time it was common to see tattoos such as skull and crossbones. The designs during the 1970s began to become more and more intricate and detailed. Full bodysuits and sleeve tattoos became popular, and this only continued into the 80s. A flourishing music industry, in particular rock and punk music, meant more and more people began to have tattoos, and the industry flourished further. The 90s became the decade of tribal tattoos and Chinese letters, but on top of this the riot girl movement became agitated with the male-dominated punk industry, and this led to a boom in women getting tattoos. By 1996, more than half of people getting tattoos were women, and permanent makeup also made a swift return. The 21st century saw the improvement of industry standards such as even more sterile equipment and environments, so getting a tattoo now has never been safer. One poll showed that in 2019 30% of Americans had at least one tattoo. This was up 21% from 2012. This is a clear sign of industry growth, and the tattoo industry has blossomed and is now worth an estimated $3 billion US. It's likely that tattoos are only going to become more and more popular for many years to come. As always, thank you for watching the history of. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and maybe just pop a little comment down below with any topics you'd like me to cover in the future.